Greetings. I'm glad you're here. I'm Karen Anderson, and our website is called luminousself.com. This is a story from my own family that really illustrates the roots of addiction that so often lie in toxic shame. This is a story about my father, who is no longer on the planet. He was born more than 100 years ago, in 1921, in Sweden. And a couple of years after he came to the planet, his entire family, his mother and father, and 7 older brothers and sisters, emigrated to the United States. His dad was an engineer, and I imagine that he felt there were more opportunities for him in America than in Sweden. And so they settled in New York City in a part of Brooklyn called Bay Ridge, which at that time was very Scandinavian, and they lived their lives. My dad grew up, and World War II was underway, and he was enlisting in the army and about to go overseas when his older sisters sat him down and told him something that he had no idea was the case. They said, "Peter, the mother that raised you, our mother, is not your real mother. Your real mother is in Sweden. And she and our father had an affair, and you were the result." My aunt told me later that my father was so ashamed that he said to his older sisters, "I hope I never come back from the war." He just felt like he couldn't face anybody, and that his situation in life was completely his fault. He had had absolutely no inkling that this was the case because the mother that raised him doted on him, and his older sisters did the same. He was the youngest in the family, and they just loved him so much that he had no idea that he was not an original member of this family. So he went off to Europe and ended up being in charge of a prisoner of war camp in Belgium. And as we grew up, my brother and I, our house was filled with original oil paintings. And the story of those paintings is that my dad saw that the prisoners in the camp were totally bored, had nothing to do, and that somehow he found out that many of them had artistic talent. And so he made a deal with them and said, "I'll buy the canvas and the paints, and you can do whatever you want with them, but we get to keep all the paintings. None of them can go with you." And lots of the men agreed to this. And so I grew up in a home that was filled with beautiful oil paintings, all landscapes of scenes that I had never witnessed, because they were all from these men's memories of places that they had been in Europe. I had a wonderful photo of my dad as a young man standing under the Eiffel Tower, and he told my brother and me that when he was in charge of the POW camp, he trained his sergeant to sign his name as closely to my dad's signature as he could get it, so that my dad could actually go away without anyone above him knowing it and have adventures all over Europe. He went to Switzerland to see his older brother, who he idolized, and he ended up in Paris. He skied, he did all kinds of things, and nobody ever was the wiser. So my dad had wonderful memories of World War II. He never saw fighting. He never really endured any trauma, and he managed to have a lot of fun in his own inimitable style. So life went on. he eventually met and married my mom, and my brother and I were coming into the world, and life went on as life goes on in suburban America until I was around 16. And I got home from school one day, and my mom sat me down and said, "The International Red Cross called our house today, and they were looking for your father." And I was really puzzled by this. And she went on to say that, "We think you're old enough now to understand this, that your dad was not born to the mom that raised him, but his father had an affair with the au pair in their family, who remained in Sweden when they came to America. And this relationship continued, although we didn't know this at the time, and I'll tell you more about that later. But in any case, his mom was now quite elderly and simply wanted to know that her son, that she had never seen grow up, was okay. And as soon as my dad heard about this, he immediately wanted to send her money. He thought that maybe that's why she was getting in touch, because she was destitute and needed some support. But the Red Cross assured them that no, this was not the case. She was fine. She was in an old people's home in Sweden, living out her life, and she simply wanted to know that her son was okay. And so when our mom told us this, my dad went into hiding, and we saw very little of him for the next 2 days. That toxic shame had arisen again, and once again he felt completely bad about himself for being what he called illegitimate. And Mom said to us, he just can't face you. He feels this will bring so much shame on you that you won't want anything to do with him. And my brother and I were basically flabbergasted. None of that was going through our minds. We were of a whole different generation and had a really different way of looking at the situation. And so we went to our dad and we said, "Dad, we don't even believe there is such a thing as illegitimacy. No child is illegitimate. Every baby has a mother and a father. And that's all we need to know. We didn't know about your mother in Sweden, but we don't have anything with you about this. We love you as much as we always have." He was a wonderful father and did everything for us. And this information didn't change any of that for us. But could it have been one of the underlying reasons, or maybe the biggest underlying reason, why my dad drank every day of his life when he got home from work? He was not an angry alcoholic or anything like that. He was a very gentle and quiet man who worked in middle management in a big corporation, and I'm sure was not really satisfied by what he was doing with his life, but he made the most of it. He had a lot of clients that he needed to visit all around the country, so for a lot of our childhood, he was away often throughout the week because he had to go and visit these clients. And he would remember all the clients' wives' names and their children's names, and he had little index cards where he would write everything down about these people so that when he saw them again, he could make really caring conversation with them. And that was the kind of person he was. But that toxic shame, that feeling that there was something so wrong with him that he should hide from the people that loved him, had to be a part of what kept him drinking every day of his life, in addition to the fact that he may not have ever been able to realize his innermost dreams, whatever they might have been. We never really heard about them, and maybe he wasn't even in a position to allow himself to dream about what he might do with his life. The drinking began before he even knew about this, before the war started, before he was shipped overseas, he worked on the shipyards in Brooklyn. And he would tell us stories about working all day on the shipyards, probably really long hours, then going out with his buddies until way early in the morning, just drinking until he was drunk, going home, sleeping for an hour or two, and getting up and doing the whole thing again. And he lived like this for a couple of years before he was shipped overseas. So we knew that the drinking had been a big part of his life, and it was something that he always found great joy in. He never seemed to have a hangover. The next day he was fine, and he would just laugh about his escapades with his friends when he was young. So this story of Pete's origins kind of receded into the background until I was somewhere in my mid to late 20s, I think, living in a whole different part of the country. And my mom called one day and said that somebody had called her out of the blue that said he was the son of my dad's brother, a brother he never knew he had in Sweden. And it turns out that after my dad's family emigrated to the U.S. and settled in Brooklyn, his father continued to go back and forth to Sweden, ostensibly for work, but apparently also to continue the relationship with the young woman who had borne my father into the world. And they had a second son. And this child was not adopted into the family, as my dad had been, but stayed in Sweden and was apparently raised in a series of foster homes. He eventually married, and he and his wife had one son, who was the man that was contacting my family now. And so over the next couple of years, there were many phone conversations back and forth between these brothers, these full brothers, who had never known of each other's existence. And at some point in the mid-90s, my dad, my brother, and I went to Sweden to meet this man and his family. And we had a delightful visit for 2 weeks in Stockholm. And while the brothers were very different in certain ways, including their physical appearance, they found many similarities, enough to make it uncanny. And it turned out that a Swedish magazine did a feature story on them with some wonderful photos of the two guys together doing arm wrestling and just being brothers. And although his brother drank socially, he did not become the everyday serious drinker that my dad did. He had a different kind of psychological constitution. He seemed much sturdier and didn't really exhibit any of the kind of toxic shame that we had seen in my dad. He was a very robust, hale and hearty kind of a guy who liked to go out elk hunting, as he called it, and in Sweden, elk means moose. And he took us to some places where he liked to go out in nature and hunt for elk. They had a country house south of Stockholm, so we really got to see the way that privileged Swedish people were able to live. And it was a really lovely life. So for whatever reasons, my dad's brother was able to live his life without succumbing to the kind of shame that always plagued my father. Even though Stig-Åke was raised in foster homes, and we really don't know much about those situations at all, he somehow came out of it more emotionally unscathed than my father did, even though Dad was raised in a home where everybody doted on him and did everything they could to make his life wonderful. Somehow, in the mind of Pete, that identity as a, quote, illegitimate child was one that he identified with for the whole rest of his life. And no matter how well his life turned out in so many ways, he still deeply rested in that identity based in the toxic shame of feeling that he was somehow wrong from birth or before birth. If only Pete had been able to look at the beliefs and judgments he held so deeply in his psyche and to question them, and ultimately to see that none of them had anything to do with reality, his life might have been so different. My brother and I probably inherited the genetic material that leads to addiction because my brother became a daily drinker. And in my early life, in my 20s and early 30s, I also drank quite a lot. In fact, I'd go out with my friends and I could drink more than all of them probably put together and feel no ill effects the next day, which only reinforced the tendency, right? But at some point in my early 30s, years after I'd begun to explore the spiritual world, I just received an inner message one day that said, you need to stop everything. It's in your way. By then, most of the drug experimentation had dropped away, but I was still drinking and still enjoyed that feeling of getting a little numb or somehow altering my consciousness so it seemed that there was less pain and more joy. But through divine grace, when I received that message, it all stopped. I can't say I stopped. It stopped. All the mechanisms that led to the drinking most days of the week were gone. They had been disabled by the great divine disabler. And from then on, it's been over 40 years, and there hasn't been an issue around drinking or not drinking. It's just no longer part of this life pattern. So I wish for the same kind of divine intervention for everybody else who is struggling with some sort of addiction, because that's so much easier than having to find our way through the addiction on our own, so to speak. In fact, that's never the case. And what anyone can do is pray for deliverance. Just talk to God and Christ and say, I know this is in my way, or I have a very big feeling that this is in my way. And please lift the temptation from me. Just lift the desire for whatever substance it might be from me so that I can go free and so that my consciousness can expand in all the ways it wants to do that with no impediments, no habits, no anything in the way. And if it feels right to you, ask to be taken into the deep roots of the addiction or the habitual using. Ask to be taken into the guilt, the shame, the hopelessness, the there's something wrong with me belief, whatever it might be within your psyche that is keeping that behavior going. And you will be taken there. And all you need to do, and it's a big ask, is not identify with any of it. Know that none of it is who you really are. All of it is what you may have come in this lifetime to experience so that you could transcend it, just as I did, just as so many others are in the process of doing. And if there's any way that I or Barry and I can support you in that process, we are here. And we seem to specialize in deep dives with people into the core of their suffering and the bottom bombshell beliefs and judgments that are keeping that suffering going. We are here. Don't hesitate to reach out. And in the meantime, I send you all love and blessings along your way, along with a reminder that none of us is awakening alone. None of us is doing any of this alone. We are really and truly all in this together. And as one of us lifts out of the core of our suffering, the way is made easier for every one of us. So thank you for all the inner work that you have been doing as a part of your awakening. And may we all blossom and thrive. Lots of love. Bye for now.